Today on Quest, Father Daniel Duplantis. Life is a quest for logic and reason. It is a quest to find balance between science and faith. Life is a quest for knowledge and understanding. But most importantly, it's a quest for personal discovery. Whatever your quest, knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom. Welcome to Quest. Hi everyone, I'm your host, Todd Fischer, and this is Season 2 of Quest. For those of you that might be new listeners, let me tell you a little about me. I'm the founder of Metacortex and the author of the best-selling book, Metacortex: The Grand Design. I'm a philosopher, a theorist, and a metaphysicist. I'm a perpetual pupil of theology and an expert in comparative religious study. I've also extensively researched the mind-body connection, anatomy, and physiology. I'm a researcher and a storyteller. And in order to tell this story, the research is necessary, and part of the research is the search. And that brings us to why I created the Quest podcast. A quest is a search for something, and this podcast will show you how we know what we know through interviews with people that have incredible stories of dedication and perseverance. To me, curiosity is part of what makes us human, and there's still so much we don't know. There's joy in discovery. It's what drives us. It's our quest. Hi everyone, welcome back to Quest. Today my guest is Father Daniel Duplantis, and our topic is, if we were in the end days, would we know it? Here are perspectives on it in this incredible interview. I hope you enjoy it. Hi Father Dan, welcome to the Quest podcast.
Hey Todd, how are you?
Pretty good, pretty good.
Good.
So I've already been lucky to work with you on a sister podcast that my company has. You were on the Religious Hippies podcast, and I really enjoyed the conversation that you had with her. And I was like, I've got to get you on mine and talk about something. I had to figure out a topic I want to talk about. Yeah. And I've got a really cool topic today that I want to touch on that's really, I think, fairly current with how people are feeling in the world today. But before we get into it, you have such a really interesting, cool story about how you became a priest. So I wanted you to share with my listeners a little bit about your backstory and what you were like growing up, and you went into the Air Force and then eventually migrated over to become a priest. Would you share a little bit about your early life?
Yeah, for sure. So I was born and raised in Houma, Louisiana. So it's about 60 miles southwest of New Orleans, which when I say something like that, people are surprised there's something more or less south of New Orleans. But we're down here. But I grew up in a very Catholic family, so both sides of the family are very devout. I think both sides of the family praying for a priest in the family. And so I'm actually a twin. I have a twin brother, Matthew. And so we did everything together more or less for 19 years, including going to the same college with the same major before I went to the seminary. But growing up, I did a lot of fishing, started martial arts when I was 7 years old, and I just got my third degree black belt back in December. So that was a really, really cool thing to do. Very intense test with that. So it's the Kukkiwon style Taekwondo out of South Korea. So I've been loving doing that for 20 years. And then also I had a interest in the military at a young age as well. I have an uncle who married into the family, and he was in the Army for 20 years. And when I entered the seminary, he said, Dan, we need a lot of priests in the military. So he said, I really think you should consider becoming a chaplain. So I kind of took him up on the invitation, and I started doing some research into what do chaplains actually do, looking at also specific branches, Army, Navy, and Air Force. And I talked to my bishop, and when I told him the idea, he said he had some kind of personal debt to the Air Force that he owed them a chaplain. And so he said, here you are, you have my blessing. So I've been serving in the Air Force now. This June will make 5 years. And so I am transitioning over to become a more or less full-fledged chaplain. I've been a candidate for the last 4.5 years. But have been to some really, really awesome places, including Keesler Air Force Base in Biloxi, where the hurricane hunters are, and also Barksdale Air Force Base up in Bossier City, Louisiana. That's by Shreveport. And that is where we have our B-52 Stratofortress bombers. So I've done some really cool things over the last few years. But yes, I'm currently the associate at the Cathedral of St. Francis de Sales in the Diocese of Houma-Thibodeau.
Wow. Well, we talked about being in the military. I was reading about that there aren't a lot of chaplains in the Air Force or generally in the military, that there's actually a lot fewer than the need is. I think I was reading that the Air Force had 60 priests currently on active duty serving 80,000 Catholic airmen. Is that right? Is there really a lack of?
That's pretty accurate. And that's the thing, when you look at the amount of chaplains total in the military, it's not just priests. We have just about any type of religion. But Catholic priests is what we call HDLD. It's called high demand, low density, meaning that there's a low density of Catholic priests, but we have such a high demand because a quarter of the entire military is Catholics. And so with the shortage in the priesthood, we've had a shortage in Catholic chaplains. And so the Air Force is actually doing pretty well off compared to our sister services. When you look at the Army has more chaplains than we do, but they serve more Catholics. And then the Navy has fewer priests than we do. I think they have about 40 active duty priests, but they serve many more Catholics than the Air Force, because the Navy chaplains serve the Navy, the Marines, the Coast Guard, the Merchant Marine, and all their components. That's active, Guard, and Reserve. So we really, really do need more priest active duty. And that's the idea behind the Archdiocese co-sponsored program, is to get guys to go active duty for at least 5 years, if not longer.
Wow, that is very interesting. Tell me what a chaplain does in the military. What purpose do you serve there? Or do chaplains act like, are you actually having a service, or are they more like counselors to people? How do they function within the military?
It's really all of that. So we say that chaplains have two purposes, really, primarily. The first one is providing the needs of our own faith group. So for me, that would be providing the sacraments to Catholics in the military. The second thing is providing for the needs. I'll kind of repeat the first one against the second one. Providing the needs versus providing for the needs. Providing for the needs means that if we have someone who's a different religion from us, or even different denomination, if we have a Protestant come up to us and needs something, we provide for their needs as best as possible. So, for example, if the commander receives a religious accommodation request from someone, it's their responsibility to make sure that it's granted, or at least fulfilled. We're usually the commander's means of doing that. So if we need to find, like for someone who's Jewish, if we need to find a civilian rabbi to come and perform a particular service, we make sure that we provide for that need. So we will call a civilian rabbi. As a Catholic priest, I would not facilitate Jewish services myself.
Sure.
At the same time, we do perform things like counseling. In fact, I think we would say that's about 90% of what chaplains do. There's a lot of walk-in counseling, or we'll have people who we'll have like commanders, or we'll have first sergeants who will refer their airmen to us and say, hey, I think you should just go see the chaplain. And so we'll get a call from the commander or the first sergeant, and they'll say, hey, I'm sending you somebody. And we just sit there and we listen, because in the military, the only people who have what we say is privileged communication, or 100% confidentiality, is the chaplain corps. Chaplains, you can come in and tell us anything, and we cannot tell a soul. It's in many ways derived after the Catholic seal of confession. And so there are times where we can divulge if we're given written permission by the service person. But other than that, even if they say, chaplain, I'm contemplating committing suicide, we can't tell anybody. Best thing we can do is to get them to self-report, to get the help that they need. Or even if they say, chaplain, I'm thinking about killing the base commander tomorrow. We can't say anything direct other than maybe tell the base commander, you might not want to come to work tomorrow, something along those lines. But yeah, we do a lot of just behind the scenes. We'll do work for funerals as well. So we have we have military customs and courtesies for funerals. And so we'll take care of all of those things as well. With the honor guard. And so there's a lot of different things that chaplains do. It's a very busy, active type of priesthood for those of us priests who end up going that route.
That's fascinating. Are chaplains generally officers or enlisted men, or does it matter? Is it both?
Chaplains are always officers, and that's because chaplains in the military have to have a master's in divinity. And so since you have an advanced graduate degree, it qualifies you as an officer. We do have enlisted in the chaplain corps, and that's in the Army, Navy, and Air Force, and depends on the branch, but we all call them more or less about the same thing. We call them religious affairs specialists, religious affairs airmen, and those are enlisted people who they're trained to kind of be like our eyes and ears in a sense. And so in many ways, they're with the enlisted. They kind of bridge the gap between our enlisted who might have a problem coming to a chaplain because they see the officer rank as opposed to the cross or the tablets on our uniforms. And so the religious affairs enlisted have the approach communication as well. And then also they take care of helping to maintain chapel facilities. Religious affairs specialists usually they're combat trained, whereas chaplains are not allowed to touch weapons. We're considered non-combatants. Our religious affairs airmen are usually the ones that we're paired with when we're downrange on deployments as I guess more or less like a bodyguard. They don't like being called that, but that's more or less, they're the ones trained to do that if necessary.
I see. That's interesting. Any chance you might laterally move over to Space Force and be the first priest in space?
Well, so the way that the Space Force is working is kind of how the Marine Corps works with the Navy. In terms of priest, is that I don't think we're going to have specifically designated, like, for example, I won't be able to commission as a Space Force officer. I think that would have been absolutely awesome. But I think the way it's going to work is that just as the Marine Corps has Navy chaplains, the Space Force is going to have Air Force chaplains, since they're both in the department of the Air Force, even though they're separate services now. And so I imagine that just like the Navy assigns Navy chaplains to Marine Corps bases, they're going to assign Air Force chaplains to Space Force bases, and we'll still maintain our designation as Air Force chaplains.
Yeah, I see. The first priest in space idea, I think, is a great idea. But
I said the same thing when I found out we were getting a Space Force. Not going to lie, that thought did cross my mind.
I want to know, so, you've become a priest. So when did you have the first thought about doing that? Was this something that goes back to you're a young boy and you're like,
oh,
I'd love
yeah.
to be a priest? It does. It goes back that far.
It does. I remember before I was in pre-K, so I must have been maybe about 3 years old. My grandparents would babysit my brother and I before we got to school. And so I remember while mom and dad were at work, both sets of grandparents on my mom's side and my dad's side had religious supply catalogs. And I would look through these catalogs and I would pick out like vestments and chalices and things like that. So from an early age, I remember at least having the desire to do those things and playing mass at one point. I remember actually my mom cutting out little circles of bread and pretending I was handing out communion. And I started altar serving when I was in 4th grade. And I guess you could say I never stopped. I just kept getting promoted.
Wow. So you became a deacon, and eventually you decided that you wanted to become a priest. So tell me how that transition happens. How do you go from being a deacon to being a priest? What's involved in that process?
So when you enter the seminary, at some point, every seminarian will become a deacon that ends up becoming a priest. And the idea is that you progress through the different orders of the church. And so, and Amber knows a lot about this, especially because she goes to the Latin Mass a lot. I actually celebrate the Latin Mass as well. We have what's called major and minor orders. Now, in the Novus Ordo Mass, the minor orders have more or less been suppressed and reduced down to 2, and that's lector and acolyte. And so what happens is as you go through the seminary, there's different stepping stones towards the priesthood. So at some point you're instituted as a lector. So you would read at masses. Then we also have acolytes. That's the next step. And so acolytes, they altar serve, but they can also purify the vessels. They can do communion services. Acolytes can purify the vessels at mass. I think I said that one already. They can do exposition of the Blessed Sacrament. They can't do benediction, but they can at least do simple exposition. And so when you get to your last year in the seminary, you're normally ordained what we call a transitional deacon, meaning that you're not going to be a deacon for very long. You're in a sense learning how to be ordained before you become a priest. And so as a transitional deacon, I know at our seminary in New Orleans, we had a 5-month internship. So we were put in a parish for our last summer in the seminary and then the first half of the fall semester. And so that way we're getting hands-on experience doing weddings, baptisms, funerals, getting to preach. And so it's a supervised internship. And so we get basically scored also by our pastor. We also have a lay support committee who is responsible for meeting with us frequently just to let us know how we're doing, give us some feedback. They would give us evaluations of our homilies. And so there are different things that they're looking for as they listen to my homilies, just to give me feedback on what's been working, what's not really working, any kind of recommendations. And so we get, and I think that's a really cool thing that our seminary does, is that, you know, we get like the laity involved with getting to form their priests, which they are absolutely proud of being able to do. To say that they get to sit there and get to give us feedback, you know, from families, from young, old couples, from single people, you know, every walk of life, they get to give us feedback on what they want from us as priests, as people who are ministering to them. So it's a really, really cool diaconate program. And so I was very fortunate that we were able to do that.
That's incredible. That's really interesting. I've always wondered about kind of how the whole system worked. I've known a lot of regular church attending people that have become deacons and kind of achieved the highest level they could become without becoming a priest.
Yeah.
And I think in some cases, I think I might even, and I might correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I think you can be married and be a deacon, right?
If you're a permanent deacon, right. And that's different from what we do, is because as transitional deacons, you're going to be a priest. You are a seminarian.
Right.
The permanent deacons are guys who have discerned that they're called to be deacons. And yes, they can be married. If they're already married, then their wife normally has to agree to every step of the process, because she's in many ways involved in his ministry. Once you are ordained a deacon, if you're not married, you cannot get married. You do take on celibacy if you're not married as a permanent deacon. And if you're a married permanent deacon and your wife passes away, you cannot remarry. Is the idea behind that. So at some point, you probably would end up becoming a celibate deacon if your wife passes away, or if you've never been married before.
I see. I'm wondering, it seems on the news, if you hear anything about a religion, it's generally bad these days.
Right.
And I think a lot of religions have been dogged by the media in terms of improprieties within religions. And I wonder, do these things is the priesthood in jeopardy of having young people that want to join it because of this system of media trying to break down church, or just generally maybe families leaving the church over time? The church is getting fragmented. I travel all over the country, and I try to pop in churches from city to city. And some of the things that disturb me is just the lack of younger people in church today. Yeah. And is that happening within the priesthood? Are there fewer and fewer people enrolling, or have the numbers remained steady?
I mean, well, I'll tell you what it's looked like from the last decade, at least, is that the seminaries, at least in Louisiana, have been popping. We've been almost full to capacity and seem to get bigger and bigger every year. And I remember, I think about a year or two before I entered the college seminary as an undergraduate, I think the enrollment at the seminary was about 70, 80 guys, something around that. By the time I had entered and the time I graduated from that seminary, we were up to about 150. So we had almost doubled in the span of about 5 years. And then at the graduate seminary, we were full to capacity, to the point where they were telling some of the guys that we don't have room in the back parking lot anymore where the seminarians would normally park. We need a few of you guys to start parking in the front circle. And so at least in Louisiana, we're experiencing the opposite problem. I mean, you look at the vocations posters, because most dioceses have a poster of all their seminarians. You're seeing, like, for the larger dioceses like New Orleans and Lafayette, who have somewhere in the ballpark of about maybe 30 to 40 guys, which is incredible to see that kind of number. Even my diocese, we're the smallest in Louisiana, perhaps one of the smallest in the country. We only have 39 church parishes. But we've maintained somewhere in the range of a dozen to, I think, up to 18 was the highest we had, which was a really good number for us. Ideally, the ratio you want to have is for every 3 church parishes, you want 1 seminarian in your diocese. So we have 39 parishes in our diocese here. We want to have ideally about 13 guys per year in the seminary.
Interesting. So when you complete the seminary, do people have their picks of places where they want to go? Are you assigned a place to go? Do you stay in your local area? Are you does someone within the Catholic Church say you're going to go to Philadelphia and you're going to work in this church? How does that end work?
Right. So you stay within your diocese. So, for example, with Homa Thibodeau, we're a very small diocese. Most people have never heard of us before. We're so small that you could probably drive across our diocese east to west in about an hour, maybe not even that long. We're very, very small. We're the equivalent of about 2.5 counties, which you look at some dioceses, like I think Montana, for example, is one diocese for the whole state. It just depends on, population density of your Catholics. And so what happens is, like, I will always stay within those 2.5 counties as a diocesan priest, except when I go active duty with the Air Force. But as far as assignments go, the bishop is the one who basically makes the assignments, but he has a priest council and a personnel committee that meet regularly throughout the year to look at who is upcoming, who is ready for a move, who's kind of reached the end of their term. We do, in a sense, have terms as priests in assignments. And so they look at who's ready for a move, who has maybe requested a move. And kind of just, talking and praying about what's the best fit for the parish and the priest. And so they're looking at what each priest's specific gifts are. For example, the bishop knows that I like working with schools. My mom is in her 32nd year teaching. My dad's on the school board. I was an education major before seminary. That's just the family business. So the bishop knows I'm comfortable with schools. And so I was at Nicholls State University for 6 months. And then now I'm at the cathedral with our own parochial school. So they look at your gifts and things like that, and then they usually meet throughout the whole spring, usually from about this time of the year, in early part of the calendar year, up through April and May is when they finally get to making those decisions and notifying the priest of who's being moved to where. And so, yeah, in a sense, you can kind of tell the bishop. We usually have one-on-one annual meetings with him where he asks, like, how are you doing? Do you like where you are? And things like that. And so we kind of get to say, what we'd like to do, what kind of charisms we'd like to be involved in, but more or less he and the personnel committee make the decisions of who's going where.
I see. How long is the term?
I think it really depends on the diocese. In Homa Thibodeau, a normal pastoral assignment as a pastor specifically, most of our pastors are assigned for about 6 years. You'll see some cases where our newly ordained priests are usually assigned as associate pastors for 3 years, which is relatively short, considering the shortage in the priesthood. We're trying to get guys to become pastors, and so usually you'll be an associate for about 3 years and then get your first parish. Sometimes what happens is the bishop will assign you as an administrator of a parish for a year, which has a little bit less canonical privileges than being the pastor of the parish. But that's kind of more of a probationary period to see, just like, is this a good fit? Is this going to work for the future? And if at the end of that year they say, yes, this will work, then they'll assign you as a pastor for 6 more years or something to that effect. We say that there's term limits. At the same time, the bishop can always just say, hey, I really need you to move. You could, if you want to say no, say no, but I really kind of need you to go to this place. And I know you're not quite done with your term, but that happens. We take that promise of obedience, and we know that can happen. I didn't intend to get moved to a different parish 6 months into being a priest, but the bishop said, hey, the cathedral needs a new associate pastor. And with COVID right now, the needs are greater there than at the university. So it's kind of the conversation that happens sometimes.
Yeah. I want to ask you, and this kind of bridges into the topic I wanted to get into today, but I think everyone can agree that 2020 was a very unique year, and it was hard for so many people. And I remember, it was funny because I had just really launched my Quest podcast when COVID started to hit. Yeah. And I had 2 or 3 episodes that had been pre-recorded, all professional, nice sound studio work, real. And then the world shut down seemingly kind of overnight. And then everything became Zoom interviews, and everything changed how people were interacting. And I remember one of the first things that really bothered me was church closures, because I felt like a church was an essential service. And I want to know your feelings on that, because it's more, to me anyways, it's more than just, you're communing with God on that particular day of the week that you would go to church. But there were also other services. A lot of churches fed people. They had, Alcoholics Anonymous meetings in their facilities. There were a lot of other reasons that churches needed to stay open. And for me, it bothered me when churches were forced to be shut down. What are your feelings on that? Was that the right thing to do?
Oh, man. I mean, Yeah, there are a lot of feelings there for sure. I think most of us would say that it was certainly unprecedented, the fact that churches were shut down more or less globally. I mean, you look at all the different plagues and pandemics that we've had around the world throughout the centuries, and I don't think at any point in time, churches throughout the world were closed. Um, and so, in many ways, we were asking the question of like, okay, well, I mean, what does that say if we're not allowed to, in times of pandemic, to be able to pray, in which I think is more important during times like this than any. And so, I understand the safety perspectives and things like that, but I think in many ways, and this is what I'll say also. I don't think you can completely shut down churches. I know we say that, we had to stop having public masses and things like that. But in many ways, the churches, in a sense, didn't shut down, because in many ways, we tried as much as possible to continue whatever ministries we were doing. I remember when all this really kind of broke out last March, the seminary let us go home to finish the semester. And that's how I ended up at the university. And almost as soon as I got there, we were figuring out, how do we live stream a mass from a cell phone? It was bonkers. It was like, wow, like I never imagined in the seminary. None of us did. No priest ever imagined we'd have to live stream our masses from our cell phones. And so we were doing that. We tried, I think we were one of the first parishes in our diocese, maybe even in the state, to try to offer some kind of drive-through confessions. We had a golf cart that we already had rigged up for confessions on campus. And so we would park it out right by the road by the church, and people came in their cars and we heard confessions. They're sitting in their car, we're sitting in the golf cart, and so we did that, and we heard, I was a deacon at the time. I was, just kind of helping direct traffic in the lines at the time. But the priests back in March and April were hearing confessions sometimes for 3 hours on a Saturday. And so that's the thing is, I wouldn't say, I know it changed a lot about the way we worship. And thank God we're, at least in Louisiana, we're back to more or less normal in terms of, having masses again. But what I'm encouraged to see was that the churches, in a sense, didn't completely shut down, at least not in Louisiana. We tried as much as possible to offer whatever services we could.
Yeah. It was really crazy to me because Walmart's open, churches aren't open. And there was just something that was really odd and unnerving to me about that there was a government in place that could shut down all the churches. And it was just really weird situation for me. I still think about it a lot, my feelings on it.
And I think we're still, what we're seeing, especially play out in the courts, is the constitutionality of something like that, because I think many governors and just any kind of, government authorities were realizing that our Constitution guarantees the right to worship. And so with that, because that is a guaranteed right, and that's in the Bill of Rights, first of all, it's the amendment in the Bill of Rights. What we're seeing play out in the courts is that, okay, well, maybe we can't tell people they can't worship. And if part of their worship, for example, with Catholics, is going to Mass, then constitutionally, we can't tell Catholics they can't go to Mass. And so we're seeing that play out in the courts right now. Is it completely fixed yet? I don't think it is, but we're seeing it more and more in different states. Churches are winning more of these cases because we're realizing the Constitution guarantees the right to be able to worship. And if that includes, for example, going to Mass, then people should be able to go to Mass.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I'm anxious to see how all this unfolds because according to the year 2020, you have the right to worship, but from the safety of your own home,
Right.
It's really, I'm a product of the 80s. I'm 51 years old. And so growing up in the 80s, I was surrounded almost daily with the threat of total global nuclear destruction. It was in the news every day. This was me at 13, 14, 15 years old. It was, we're one day closer to nuclear war. All the entertainment that was made, that's what it was about. And it was mutually assured destruction. Like it's all there was in pop culture, entertainment, and news. It was this threat of the US and the Soviet Union going at it and destroying the entire world.
Right.
And that's what it was like, for me as a young teenager. And the first time I think in 2020 is the first time I've ever felt that grim feeling again that I felt when I was 13 or 14 or 15 years old. And this, pandemic, virtually came out of nowhere. And no, no one had an eye on what it actually was. No, there were every symptom that you would get could possibly be COVID. It was no matter, my toe itches,
Oh
so it's
yeah.
probably COVID. Like,
Yeah.
and at the time when it really broke, I was in New York, and on the news you would see there were just body bags and trucks and trenches being dug to put, like, that's what you were seeing, because New York was the epicenter, and I was in there when it was happening.
Right.
And then it just became something that went across the country like a forest fire.
Oh yeah.
And it's still happening. We're nearing 1 million deaths in the world, and 250,000 in the US, and certain cities are hot spots now. LA's a hot spot. 1 in 7 people probably have COVID, and we have this slow rollout of vaccines that may or may not work, to be determined, I guess. And I think generally a lot of people feel this sense of grim, and the pandemic shut down a lot of businesses. A lot of businesses closed. People lost their jobs. They didn't have money. They couldn't pay their rent. Stimulus checks were few and far between. And I think it got tough for people, not to mention the loneliness people would feel that
Right.
didn't have anyone. So I think historically people will be writing about this in 20 years, the psychological effect alone of what went on in 2020 and even today. And of course, at the beginning of the year, at the beginning of 2021, as we record this doomsday clock was just set a little closer to doomsday, which is the closest it's ever been. And people see this. This is a big news event that happens, and it appears, there's a lot of unrest in the world. We saw that with marches and riots and different things that happened last year. We saw this at the Capitol at the beginning of this year. So I'm wondering, all these dark things happening, not just in the US, but around the world. The topic of this podcast I really wanted to get into today was, if we were in the end days, would we know it? And I wanted to bring in really a spiritual perspective of this, a religious perspective, because those that study the Bible certainly know there are creation stories, the beginnings, and then there's also kind of those end stories, the book of Revelation type of thing. And I wanted you to kind of maybe touch on some of this today, your feelings on the world we're in today and how we approach that from a religious perspective.
Yeah, definitely. And it's funny because I actually had to kind of look up what the doomsday clock was. I guess in Louisiana, most people are more concerned with shrimp season than the doomsday clock. Because I don't, no one I know of around here has really talked about the doomsday clock. I had to look up what it was. And so, but yeah, like I think with that concept, like, would we know? I think, at least from a spiritual perspective, and looking at the Gospels themselves, I think Christ says no. In a sense, that we probably wouldn't know, because what we see is in different places around the Gospel. In fact, actually, it's funny that today I was actually celebrating the Latin Mass this morning, and today we celebrate the feast of Saint Scholastica, and so she was a virgin, and so for the common of virgins, the Gospel reading is the parable of the 10 virgins. And at the very end of the passage, and maybe I'll give a brief summary of that for our listeners today. The parable of the 10 virgins, you have the bridegroom. So the groom is coming for the wedding feast. He's delayed in coming, it says. And so, and we would say that the bridegroom represents Christ. And so he's delayed in coming. And so you have these 10 virgins who have their oil lamps, and it's in the middle of the night. And some of them brought extra oil just in case they had to make it all the way through the night. So 5 of them brought extra oil. The other 5 did not. And so we would say the unwise virgins, the ones who did not bring extra oil, are asking the wise ones who did bring extra, give us some of your oil. And the wise ones say, no, because we might not have enough for ourselves to make it through the night. And so they had to be ready for when the bridegroom came. And so the unwise ones had to go in the middle of the night. It says it's about midnight or something to that effect, and go find oil somewhere. The merchants are all asleep. And so the bridegroom finally arrives, and the wise virgins go into the wedding banquet with him, and the 5 are left outside. And the very last thing the gospel passage says for the chapter, it says, stay awake, for you do not know the hour when the Son of Man will come. And so this is the thing. I know there's a big preoccupation with like the end times and things like that. I know a lot of people are trying to quote Revelation, the book of Revelation. And my thing is this. I think that it goes back to this gospel passage. It's just being prepared, and doing what the wise virgins do, and that's being ready no matter what. I think that in the history of the world, in the history of the church, we've seen similar situations where we've had maybe not so much a global pandemic, but we've had definitely some epidemics. We've had lots of wars. We've had world wars, two in the last century. And so I think when we're looking at the end times, I think what we're seeing is more or less just a cycle of history repeating itself. And because, humanity is still in a sense prone to fall, we are redeemed, but still in a sense prone to fall. We will keep making the mistakes of history because in a sense we just fail to learn them. And so this is the thing is what I tell people is really to try to calm down, and really just ask yourself like, okay, well, are you ready at all times? If Christ comes tomorrow, are you ready? If he came like right now, if he got me like that during this podcast, I mean, where's Father Dan? Where did he go? You there, Father? Am I ready? And so I think that's the question we're having to ask ourselves is really no matter when he comes, are we going to be ready if it's now or if it's 10 years, Lord knows when? The question is, are we going to be ready?
Right. And you're accurate on that. It would be you vanishing from the podcast and not me, because that's probably pretty. I want to know. Yeah, I get what you're saying. Like that makes perfect sense, and that to be ready is the key. I want to know. So in the book of Revelation, how should people interpret this book? What would you tell a person in your church about that? Is this something written in metaphor? Is this something that should be taken realistically? How do you decipher that?
All right. So the answer to that question is kind of a both and. All right. So if you look at, I think the document is Dei Verbum, which is one of the Vatican documents on the role of sacred scripture in the church. What the document says is that there are really 4 senses in which we can read scripture. One of them being the literal sense of what is the author in his time period and with his audience trying to convey. And the other thing is there's 3, we would say, spiritual senses of scripture. And so like the moral meaning, the anagogical meaning, things like that. And so we're looking, it can be both. And the thing is, Revelation is probably the most misinterpreted book in the whole Bible. And people say, because the other name for it, the Greek name, is the apocalypse. And so I think what tends to happen is people try to read Revelation as if it is a play-by-play prophecy of how the world is going to end. And what we will say is that's really not the case, is you have to look at what the author, which is identified as John, what John is saying. And what he's doing is, in many ways, he's prophesying about, in many ways, the end of the world as they would know it. When you look at the different figures, you look at a lot of the creatures in Revelation, and there's a correlation to specific figures. Like you look at like the beast, like the dragon, the serpent, whatever you want to call it. The serpent most of the time is anagogical, or is a sign for Nero. The Emperor Nero, who say the dragon came in and swept away a third of the stars in the sky. When you look at the persecutions under Nero, that's kind of what it's getting at. So you see there's like this literal sense in which he's writing in a particular time period for a particular community. He's writing for the early church. And then we see that the church is triumphant in the end. We have the new Jerusalem, the new heavens and the new earth. And we see, the woman in the sky, which we interpret to be the Blessed Mother, crushing the head of the serpent. And so with that, there's so many ways to look at it. What I would tell people is this. I would not just open Revelation and just start reading from the beginning without having a good commentary to go with it, whether that be a Bible podcast, whether that be a commentary book. There's some great material out there from Catholic sources on how to interpret Revelation. I would not recommend watching a History Channel program on Revelation, because those tend to take a very different perspective than what should be taken. But yeah, and part of it too goes back to the genre. This is what we would call the apocalyptic genre of sacred scripture. And so when we look at that genre, that's not just Revelation. We're also looking at books like Ezekiel. We're looking at the book of Daniel. which have a lot of these prophecies about, in some senses, the end of the world. And like you can look in the prophecies of Daniel, and we hear this in the Nativity Proclamation every year, right before the midnight mass for Christmas, is we have this proclamation that says, talks about like what year in the prophecy of Daniel that Christ came, because it's referring to a specific year. People knew when to expect the Messiah at his first coming, but Christ makes it very clear in the Gospels, like I said, we do not know the day or the hour when he will come in his second coming.
Right, right. Would you, well, won't say whether you should, but could it be interpreted that that second coming would be the biblical end? Is that fair to say? Is there really an end? Is there a biblical end?
Right,
Is there...
because all people are destined for God, and so in a sense, like the second coming, is the church believes that we say we look forward to the life of the world to come. So yeah, we would say that, but again, a lot of this comes down to what people tend to be questioning more and more, and I guess in more duress about is this it? And so again, I think from a spiritual perspective, what I try to tell people is whether this is it or not, are you ready? Is what usually I try to lead them at, because this is the thing. I think so many people with COVID especially have become so aware of their mortality that they're asking that question. And so in many ways, what we're trying to do as priests, especially in confession, because we have people who come up and, when I was a deacon and getting to talk to people in those car lines for confession before I was a priest, is people would say, Deacon, like I haven't been to confession in 10 or 20 years, and like this COVID thing has me just like, I really need to get right with God. And so I think, like I said, in many ways, I try to get people to calm down and to be what we call in the chaplain corps, even a non-anxious presence, to get people to, come to grips with their mortality, but as best as possible, to not freak out, because that is the end that we're made for. We say like our final end, if we're looking at like Aristotle's final end, is to say that we were made for God. And so the question is, if that's what we're made for, why should we be afraid of that? I guess people are afraid if they're not ready. And I guess that's what it comes down to, is, are we ready?
Right. That's an excellent point. Excellent point. I think what 2020 was such a tough year for people. Do you think when something like what we had in 2020 happens, that more people find spirituality in that way? Do you think that there is there a push to go into organized religion or try to seek out spirituality in some way when things look grim? Or do you think it works the opposite and people retreat into their aloneness and things get worse for them?
No, I think it's the former. I think people tend to try to seek out some sense of spirituality, at least, and because this is what we would say, is again, like I just said, like we're made for God. In the sense, man is made for worship, and if we don't worship God, we will worship something or someone else. And for a lot of people, that ends up being themselves if that person's not God. And so with that, I think, because I saw it again, standing in those confession lines, talking to people, and so. I think there's a study done recently, I can't remember which one, but I saw an article recently that said that with the pandemic, more people have been at least approaching, churches or different types of religions, just to, come to grips with what is happening. And so I think with that, when people hit rock bottom, I think people tend to do one of two things. They either tend to turn unto themselves and wallow in self-pity, or they tend to turn to God. It's usually one of those things that happens. It's very difficult to stay at rock bottom. People tend to try to either do one thing, either self-medicate or rise above it. And so I think what we're seeing now with this pandemic is that there are more people who are at least trying to look into religion, maybe not so much committing to it, but we are seeing a lot of people trying to do some discovery, try to figure out, what's the meaning of all this? Is there a point in all this? Is there a way out of all this? And many of them are coming to ask the question, like, God says all the time in scripture, he would never abandon us. And so in this case, what is his role in this pandemic, especially if he's the one who's there for us and who does not abandon us in these situations?
Absolutely. Those are beautiful words. What are your feelings on social media and how it affects people today? Is this a good or a bad tool for us?
I think in and of itself, we would say social media is morally neutral. What happens is that people will then choose to use it for either good or for evil. And so what we're seeing is we're seeing some people, and we were talking about, one of the podcasts that you helped to produce with Amber Rose, a podcast and someone who uses social media to great effects to evangelize. At the same time, we see a lot of people use social media to cast lies, misinformation, hatred, even, people who from what I see in many ways sometimes hide behind their keyboards and their screens and say things on social media they would never say to somebody in person. And so it really just comes down to what the individual chooses to use it for. So I think in some ways we can look at this pandemic. There's a lot of people who spread misinformation with this pandemic. At the same time, social media was our means of communicating with our parishioners when we couldn't have mass in public. Every single priest at that time was turning to Facebook Live to stream their masses. Now, some of them are still on Facebook Live. Some of them have branched out to different other types of streaming medias. But that was like the first one. If it wasn't for social media, I can't imagine what we would have done to connect with our people through this pandemic. So it really kind of goes both ways.
Yeah, for sure. Technology definitely came in a pinch in that situation. Oh, yeah. For sure. I didn't even know what Zoom was before the pandemic.
I didn't either until my professor said, "Hey, we're doing the rest of our classes on Zoom. Here's the link." Huh. What is
I knew what Skype was, and I had seen ads for Zoom, and I never thought it was for me. But boy, Skype, I think, really dropped the ball on this one, that they didn't get the market share when they had a chance.
Skype has been around for at least a decade, maybe longer than that, Lord knows. But yeah, you're right. Zoom seemed to have come out of nowhere and said, "Hey, we have a solution," and it worked.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it did. And I almost exclusively do my podcast this way now. Right. So it's super handy for me. But it was definitely an interesting year to look back on, and we might have just as an exciting 2021. It's to be determined, I think, how this year is going to go. But I wanted to certainly have you on and have you talk about this a little bit and put people's minds at ease. But such great stuff you had to say. You're such a unique and wonderful person. I think you're actually suited perfectly for this and where you're at today in the world. And I even think, this Air Force experience, this world of being a chaplain is assisting in greater ways than could have been imagined maybe 3 or 4 or 5 years ago, how this could come in handy for you too, as another tool. And I mentioned social media, whether that was good or bad. People can find you on social media, and there's a lot of great footage of you breaking boards and doing karate stuff. And it's pretty exciting social media page you have. But can people find you out there on the interwebs, or do you want people to? How can they reach you? How can they find you?
I don't have a lot of social media. I have the two I'm usually on more than anything are Facebook and Instagram. So my Facebook is a personal profile, but my Instagram, which is currently a private profile, but if you send me a request, more than likely I'll probably I'll follow you back and all that. My Instagram handle is Father Timeline. It's one word. Father Timeline is my fraternity name from when I was a music major, because they knew I was going to become a priest, and they also knew I also have an affinity for history, so they called me Father Timeline. So if you go to Father Timeline on Instagram, you can find me there. And I'm usually posting things, at least, sometimes daily, sometimes not. But yeah, usually some cool videos of things I do as a priest. And especially with my martial arts, I have a lot of friends that do Taekwondo with me. And so you'll see a lot of that stuff on there as well. And just stuff with the Air Force also. So, but yeah, that's.
And if you happen to find yourself south of New Orleans, and you don't need a swamp boat, we can actually visit you, right?
Oh, you can. Yeah, you can. And you can get here by car, no problem. It's but we do have some beautiful swamp tours down here. It's a beautiful landscape. All the best seafood you can eat in the world. I mean, you name it, we got it down here. I say this is God's country, and I'm definitely blessed to be a priest here in Houma, Thibodeau. It is. When I say there's no place like Houma, because for me this is a wonderful place to be a priest, and I thoroughly enjoy being down here.
I was a while back. I was driving through Texas, and I thought I should call Amber and see if I could come through Louisiana and visit Father Dan and pop in for a visit. But then I couldn't make the trip work out to do it. But I was very close. But I do want to pass through and see where you're at and meet you in person and.
Oh, for sure.
And,
yeah.
Take in a mass. That would be wonderful. But I appreciate you coming out today and chatting with me. And I hope we can do it again.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Take care, Father Dan. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
There you have it, my interview with Father Daniel Duplantis. I hope you enjoyed it. I'll see you back next week on Quest. Thank you for listening to Quest. Please be sure to rate and review this podcast. This podcast is produced by Todd Fischer and distributed by Metacortex Publishing. This podcast is copyright. Any previously trademarked or copyright content is used by permission. Be sure to visit the official website for the International Association of Metacomics at metacomics.org or find us on social media for other unique content. And make sure to pick up a copy of the book that started the spiritual revolution, Metacomics: The Grand Design, available for sale online and at most major bookstores.